The revolving glass doors of the Regal Meridian Hotel caught my reflection for just a moment before I stepped through. I barely recognized myself in that black dress hair, pulled back, nothing flashy. I had spent 30 years learning how to disappear in plain sight, and tonight was no different. At least that was the plan. My brother Evan stood near the champagne fountain with his wife Delilah, both of them draped in designer labels and false smiles. My parents flanked them like sentinels, their eyes scanning the room for anyone worth impressing. When they spotted me approaching, something shifted in their expressions. Not recognition, something closer to alarm. "Excuse me, are you the help?" Evan asked loud enough for the guests nearby to hear. "Staff should use the side entrance." I stopped walking. The words hit me like ice water, but I kept my face still. My own brother, standing 3 feet away from me, pretending he had never shared a childhood with me, never eaten breakfast across from me, never borrowed money from our parents while I worked double shifts to pay my own way through college. Delilah stepped forward, scanning me from head to toe with the kind of look people reserve for stains on expensive furniture. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured concern, "staff uniforms are supposed to be navy. You are out of dress code." The CEO of Aurelius Tech, Holden Marks, stood just behind them with his wife Juliet. He covered his mouth to hide a smirk, while Juliet leaned in to whisper something that made them both chuckle. Around us, a dozen guests in silk and diamonds watched the scene unfold like dinner theater. My mother caught my eye for a fraction of a second, then looked away. My father studied his champagne flute as if the bubbles contained the secrets of the universe. Neither of them said a word. Neither of them acknowledged that the woman being humiliated in front of international business partners was their daughter. "People like her should know their place," Holden murmured to his wife, not quite quietly enough. A waiter approached me with genuine confusion. "Miss, the service entrance is around back if you need to check in with catering." I felt the old familiar ache rise up in my chest, that hollow, burning sensation I had carried since childhood. But something was different tonight. The pain did not make me want to shrink. It made me want to wait. I excused myself and walked toward the terrace, leaving the glittering crowd behind. The city spread out below me, a million lights blinking against the darkness. I pulled out my phone and checked my email. The notification I had been waiting for glowed on the screen. Aurelius Tech, $3 billion government contract, pending final signature from founding partner. I allowed myself a small smile, the kind of smile that has nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with patience, finally paying off. I typed a message to the executive management portal. "Emergency board meeting, 8:30 tomorrow morning, mandatory attendance." I sent it through the founding authority channel, the one that bypassed every layer of corporate hierarchy and landed directly in the inbox of every person who mattered. CEO Holden Marks would receive that message within minutes. He would have no idea who sent it. The founding authority had remained anonymous for 5 years, a silent partner who owned 58% of the company and had never once shown their face at a public event. Until tomorrow. I walked back through the gala one more time, passing by my family without a glance. They were huddled together now, Delilah holding court, while my parents nodded along to whatever story she was spinning. "Did you see that poor girl?" Delilah was saying. "She looked absolutely lost. Someone really should train these event staff better." Evan laughed. "Probably some temp worker trying to sneak into the party." "Can you imagine the embarrassment?" My mother shook her head. "At least she had the sense to leave. The last thing we need is someone like that hanging around our table." I kept walking. I had heard worse from them over the years, much worse. But tonight those words felt different. They felt like evidence being collected for a case I had been building my entire life. The valet brought my car around a modest sedan that matched the modest apartment I kept in a quiet neighborhood. No one in my family knew about the penthouse downtown, the investment portfolio, the founding shares that made me one of the wealthiest women in the state. I had kept all of it hidden because I wanted freedom. I wanted to know who people really were when they thought I had nothing to offer. Now I knew. I drove home through streets slick with recent rain, the city lights blurring past my windows. My phone buzzed with a notification. CEO Holden Marks has accepted the meeting request. I pulled into my parking garage and sat in the darkness for a long moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. 20 years of being treated like family disappointment. 20 years of being told I was too sensitive, too ambitious, too difficult. 20 years of watching my brother receive everything I worked twice as hard to earn. Tomorrow morning at 8:30 sharp, every single person who had looked down on me would learn the truth. Not because I wanted revenge, because I was tired of being invisible to the people who were supposed to love me. I walked up to my apartment and stood in front of the mirror in my hallway. The woman staring back at me looked calm, composed, ready. "They called me for help tonight," I said to my reflection. "Tomorrow they will call me boss." I turned off the lights and went to bed, setting my alarm for 5 in the morning. I had a boardroom to prepare and a family to educate. The rain started falling harder outside my window, drumming against the glass like applause. I woke at 5:50 to pale gray light filtering through my curtains. The penthouse was quiet, all clean lines and warm wood, nothing ostentatious. I had designed this space to feel like a sanctuary, not a showcase. The contrast with last night's chaos felt almost surreal. I made tea and sat by the window watching the city wake up below me. The memory of Delilah's voice kept playing in my head. Staff should use the side entrance, as if I were some intruder at my own company's event. But this morning my mind felt clear. Today was the day everything would change. I checked my email one more time. The meeting was confirmed. Every executive, every board member, every person who had authority at Aurelius Tech would be sitting in that conference room in less than 3 hours. They thought they were meeting some mysterious founder, some shadowy investor who had been pulling strings from behind the scenes. They had no idea they had already met me, many times. They just never bothered to look. I showered and dressed in my sharpest suit, charcoal gray with a white blouse. Professional but understated. I was not trying to make a statement with fashion. The statement would come from the truth itself. As I prepared, I let my mind wander back to where all of this began. I grew up in Minneton, a mid-sized town where everyone knew everyone and gossip traveled faster than the speed of sound. My parents were comfortable, not wealthy, but they had aspirations that far exceeded their bank account. From the moment my brother Evan was born 2 years before me, he became the center of their universe. Evan was the future of the family. That was the phrase I heard more times than I could count. He got the private tutors, the leadership camps, the new car at 16. I got hand-me-downs and the expectation that I would help with housework while he studied. When Evan went off to college, my parents paid every cent. They rented him an apartment near campus, bought him a new wardrobe, gave him money that would have covered my groceries for a year. When it was my turn, they sat me down at the kitchen table and explained that they simply could not afford to do the same for me. I never asked them to. By then, I had already learned that asking for things only led to disappointment. So I worked. I waitressed at a diner downtown, typed data entry reports late into the night, tutored high school students on weekends. I paid my own tuition, bought my own books, found my own apartment in a building with water stains on the ceiling, and neighbors who played music until 3 in the morning. I studied computer science because I was good at it, and because it felt like a language that did not judge me. Code did not care whether I was the favorite child. Code only cared whether I got the syntax right. By the time I was 24, I had co-founded a small tech company with 2 friends from college. We worked out of a cramped apartment, surviving on instant noodles and caffeine, writing the algorithms that would eventually become the backbone of Aurelius Tech's logistics platform. When the venture capitalists came calling, my partners wanted to sell. I refused. I held on to my shares. 58% of a company that nobody believed would survive its first year. My partners thought I was foolish. My family did not even know what I was doing. They were too busy celebrating Evan's latest failed business venture, the one my parents had funded with their retirement savings. Aurelius Tech grew. Then it exploded. Within 5 years, we were worth billions, and I had quietly become one of the most powerful people in the industry. But I never wanted the spotlight. I hired Holden Marks as CEO because he seemed competent and trustworthy. I stayed in the background guiding decisions through anonymous memos and encrypted channels. I told myself I was protecting my privacy. But the truth was more complicated. I was protecting myself from my family, from their jealousy, their demands, their endless ability to make me feel small. If they knew what I had built, they would find ways to claim it, to diminish it, to remind me that no matter how much money I made, I would always be the daughter who was never quite good enough. So I kept quiet. I lived simply. I watched from the shadows as my company grew, and my family continued to treat me like the hired help. The irony was not lost on me. At Aurelius Tech events, I dressed down deliberately. I wanted to see how people behaved when they thought I was nobody. What I learned over the years confirmed everything I had suspected. The executives ignored me. The board members looked through me, and my own family pretended not to know me when it suited their image. Last night was different only in degree, not in kind. They had always treated me this way. The gala just made it public. I finished my tea and checked the time. 7:15. The meeting was in 75 minutes. My phone buzzed with messages from the family group chat. My mother was complaining about the catering at the gala. Evan was bragging about a conversation he had with CEO Holden. Delilah was posting photos of herself in her designer gown. None of them mentioned me at all. Then a new message appeared from Evan. Big meeting at Aurelius Tech this morning. The founding partner wants to discuss the $3 billion contract. This could be huge for my career. He had no idea that the founding partner was his sister. The sister he had called the help in front of 100 strangers. I put down my phone and grabbed my bag. Time to go to work. The drive to headquarters took 20 minutes. The building rose 42 stories above the downtown skyline, all glass and steel and ambition. I had helped design this tower in its earliest phases. Every floor plan, every meeting room, every piece of artwork in the lobby had my fingerprints on it somewhere. The security guard at the front desk nodded as I walked past. Good morning, Ms. Lane. The people who worked directly with the founding authority knew who I was. My executive assistant, my legal team, a handful of senior engineers who had been with me since the beginning. They kept my secret because they understood its value. In a company this large, anonymity was power. I took the private elevator to the 42nd floor. The conference room was already set up, a long table surrounded by leather chairs, a screen displaying the company logo. In less than an hour, this room would be full of people who had underestimated me for years. I sat down at the head of the table and opened my laptop. The contract documents glowed on the screen. $3 billion, the largest government deal in our company's history, and every signature required my approval. The door opened and my assistant stepped in. They are starting to arrive, she said. Should I send them up? I nodded. Let them come. One by one, they filed in. Department heads and vice presidents, legal counsel, and financial officers. They took their seats with the nervous energy of students waiting for an exam. CEO Holden Marks arrived last, looking slightly flustered. He had clearly spent the morning trying to figure out who had called this meeting and why. When my brother Evan walked through the door with Delilah trailing behind him, I felt my heart rate increase for the first time all morning. He was wearing his most expensive suit, the one he saved for occasions when he wanted to impress. He scanned the room, nodded at Holden, and took a seat near the middle of the table. Then he noticed me sitting at the head. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, annoyance, dismissal. "Arya," he said, "what are you doing here? This meeting is for executives only." Delilah leaned over to whisper something, probably a comment about my outfit or my audacity in showing up uninvited. I did not respond. I simply opened my laptop, connected it to the main screen, and watched as my credentials appeared in bold letters for everyone to see. Founding partner, majority shareholder, 58% ownership. The room went absolutely silent. Holden Marks turned pale. Evan's mouth fell open. Delilah looked like she might faint. I folded my hands on the table and looked at each of them in turn. This meeting, I said calmly, was called by the founding authority. And today, I am no longer staying silent. The silence in that conference room was so complete, I could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. 30 people sat frozen in their leather chairs, staring at the screen where my name and ownership percentage glowed in letters 3 inches tall. Holden Marks stood up so fast, his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "This has to be some kind of mistake," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. I looked at him the way you might look at a child who has just realized Santa Claus is not real. Holden, did you ever actually read the footnotes in your employment contract? The founding authority clause has been there since day one. You just never thought it would matter. Around the table, executives were frantically checking their phones and tablets, pulling up company records, searching for confirmation of what they were seeing. One by one, their faces changed as the truth sank in. Evan shook his head like a dog trying to clear water from its ears. Arya, what is this? Some kind of joke. You cannot possibly be the founder. I turned to face him directly for the first time. The brother who had called me the help less than 12 hours ago. The brother who had received everything I worked twice as hard to earn. He looked smaller somehow, sitting there in his expensive suit with sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. I am not joking, I said. I have never joked about anything worth $3 billion. Delilah grabbed Evan's arm. Her face had gone from confused to horrified as the implications began to dawn on her. She had spent last night telling everyone at the gala that I was out of dress code, that I should have used the service entrance, that people like me should know their place. Now she was sitting in a boardroom where I owned more than half of everything. A vice president I barely recognized cleared his throat. We thought you were someone from the support department, he said quietly. All these years. We had no idea. I know, I said. That was the point. Holden was still standing, his hands gripping the edge of the table like he might fall over without support. But why? Why hide it? You could have had offices, assistants, anything you wanted. I wanted to see who people really were, I said, and I saw plenty. The door opened and my parents walked in. They had received a message that their children were in an important meeting and had apparently decided to come offer moral support. My mother was already smiling her public smile, the one she wore when she wanted to impress strangers. My father looked around the room with the self-satisfied expression of a man who believed he belonged anywhere his son was invited. Then they saw me sitting at the head of the table. My mother's smile froze. What is going on here? Why is Arya sitting there? My father frowned. Is this some kind of administrative error? Arya, get up and let the real executives have their seats. The executives around the table exchanged uncomfortable glances. Several of them shifted in their chairs, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. They had just learned that I owned their company. And now my parents were treating me like a child who had wandered into the wrong classroom. I stayed exactly where I was. There is no error, I said. I called this meeting. I own 58% of this company. And I have some things to discuss with the leadership team. My mother laughed a nervous, high-pitched sound. Arya, sweetheart, whatever game this is, it is not appropriate. We are in a professional setting. Mom, Evan said, his voice strained, look at the screen. My mother turned and saw my name displayed next to the ownership percentage. The color drained from her face. I watched something shift behind her eyes, a rapid recalculation of everything she thought she knew about her children. My father stared at the screen for a long moment, then looked at me, then back at the screen. His jaw worked, but no words came out. I let them absorb it. 20 years of being dismissed, overlooked, told I was too ambitious for my own good. 20 years of watching my brother fail upward while I built an empire in secret. All of it compressed into this single moment of revelation. Holden finally found his voice again. Ms. Lane, perhaps we should discuss this privately. I shook my head. Everything I have to say can be said in front of everyone, including my family. I stood up and walked to the presentation screen. With a few clicks, I pulled up a new document. It was not the contract. It was something I had been compiling for years. This is a summary of concerns I have had about company leadership, I said. Let me be clear. I am not here for revenge. I am here for accountability. The list appeared on the screen. Female employee turnover, up 62% in 3 years. 17 harassment complaints filed and ignored. 3 whistleblower reports buried by HR. Expense account irregularities totaling several $100,000. Client entertainment spending that would make a Fortune 500 company blush. Holden's face went from pale to gray. I have been watching, I said quietly. I have always been watching. Evan stood up, pointing at me. You cannot do this. You cannot just walk in here and start accusing people of things. We are your family. I turned to face him fully. Last night, you told me to use the service entrance. You called me the help in front of 100 people. You stood 3 feet away from me and pretended we had never met." He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. "You are not my family in this room," I continued. "You are an employee whose position is currently under review." Delilah burst into tears. "This is not fair. I did not know. How was I supposed to know?" A vice president near the end of the table spoke up. "With respect, Mrs. Vale, you did not need to know who she was to treat her with basic decency." The room went quiet again. I looked at my parents who had not moved from the doorway. My mother was clutching my father's arm like she might collapse without support. My father's face had hardened into something I recognized from my childhood, that expression he wore when he was trying to figure out how to regain control of a situation that had slipped away from him. "Arya," my father said slowly, "we need to talk about this as a family, in private." I shook my head. "We have been talking as a family for 30 years. It has not helped." I turned back to the room. "CEO Marks is suspended pending an independent review of company practices. I will be appointing an interim leadership team this afternoon. All current projects continue as normal." Evan slammed his hand on the table. "What about me? What about my position?" "Your position," I said, "was given to you because of family connections, not because of qualifications." He stared at me like I had slapped him. "You are destroying everything." I looked at him steadily. "I am not destroying anything. I am finally building something that works." My mother stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Arya, please, think about what you are doing. Think about the family." I thought about the family, I said. "Every time you told me I was too sensitive, every time you paid for Evan's mistakes with money that could have helped me, every time you looked through me like I was not there." I paused, feeling the weight of 30 years pressing against my chest. "I am done thinking about the family the way you want me to," I said. "From now on, I am thinking about myself." I gathered my things and walked toward the door. As I passed my parents, my mother reached out and grabbed my arm. "Please," she whispered. "We did not know." I looked at her hand on my sleeve, then up at her face. "That is exactly the problem," I said. "You never tried to know." I pulled free and walked out of the conference room, leaving 30 people sitting in stunned silence behind me. My heels echoed on the polished floor as I headed toward the elevator. Tomorrow there would be meetings, negotiations, and decisions to be made. But right now, I just needed to breathe. The elevator doors closed, and I leaned against the wall, watching the floors count down. 41, 40, 39. Somewhere above me, my family was trying to figure out how everything had changed so fast. They would probably spend the next several hours arguing about whose fault it was, how they could have missed the signs, what they needed to do to fix things. None of them would realize that the only thing that had changed was their perception. I had always been this person. They just never bothered to look. My penthouse felt different when I returned that afternoon. The same clean lines, the same warm wood tones, the same view of the city I had built my empire watching. But something had shifted inside me, and every familiar surface reflected it back. I stood in front of the hallway mirror for a long time. The woman looking back at me had just done something unprecedented. She had walked into a room full of people who underestimated her and walked out with their futures in her hands. But her eyes did not look triumphant. They looked tired, and something else I could not quite name. I changed out of my suit and made myself a cup of chamomile tea, the kind my grandmother used to make when I was small before she passed away, and took with her the only person in my family who ever seemed to see me clearly. The afternoon light slanted through my windows as I sat on the couch and let myself remember. I was 11 years old the first time I realized I was invisible to my parents. Evan had just won a spelling bee at school, and my mother was planning a celebration dinner. She asked me to help set the table, then to help with the dishes, then to help clean up afterward while the rest of the family sat in the living room talking about Evan's bright future. That same week, I had received the highest score in my grade on a standardized math test. When I showed my father the results, he glanced at the paper and said, "That is nice, honey," without looking up from his newspaper. I learned early that achievements were measured differently for sons and daughters in my family. Evan's successes were celebrated. Mine were expected, and if they were not expected, they were ignored. The memories kept coming unbidden. 14 years old, asking for permission to join a summer coding camp. Too expensive, my mother said, even though they had just paid for Evan to attend a leadership retreat that cost twice as much. 16, winning a scholarship competition and getting a brief nod of acknowledgement before the conversation turned back to Evan's college applications. 18, working 3 jobs to pay for my own education while my parents called me every week to talk about how proud they were of my brother. I grew up in a house where I was physically present but emotionally erased. My role was to support, to serve, to make everyone else's life easier. When I had my own needs, I was told I was being selfish. When I had my own dreams, I was told I was being unrealistic. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of the past. A message from my mother. "Arya, we need to talk. Call me back immediately." I stared at the screen for a moment, then set the phone face down on the coffee table. Not yet. I was not ready to hear whatever justifications they had prepared. Another message, this one from my father. "What you did today was unacceptable. You embarrassed the entire family. We expect you at dinner tonight to discuss this properly." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Even now, after everything that had been revealed, they were still issuing commands, still expecting me to fall in line, still treating me like a wayward child who needed to be corrected. The phone buzzed again. Delilah this time. "Hey Arya, I know things got intense today, but we should clear the air. I honestly had no idea who you were at the gala. If I had known, obviously I would have treated you differently." I read that message 3 times. If I had known. The words stuck in my throat like broken glass. She was not apologizing for how she treated me. She was apologizing for not realizing I was important enough to treat well. That was always the problem with my family. They measured respect in terms of status. I was the quiet daughter who worked too hard and never seemed to get anywhere, so I deserved nothing. Now that they knew I was wealthy and powerful, suddenly they wanted to clear the air. Suddenly they wanted to talk. I put on my jacket and went outside. I needed to walk, to move, to feel something other than this hollow ache that had been building in my chest all day. The neighborhood around my building was quiet at this hour, all tree-lined streets and brownstone apartments. I passed a small park where a mother was pushing her daughter on a swing, both of them laughing at something I could not hear. The little girl looked up at her mother with pure adoration, and her mother looked back with the same. I wondered what that felt like. Being looked at like you mattered simply because you existed. Being loved without having to earn it over and over again. My phone buzzed once more. This time it was a text from Evan. "Arya, we need to talk right now. Do you have any idea what you have done to my career? I had a promotion coming. Holden was going to announce it next month. You just destroyed everything I worked for." I stopped walking and read the message again. Everything I worked for. As if his position had been earned through talent and dedication rather than family connections and inherited opportunities. As if he had ever worked half as hard as I did for anything in his life. I did not reply. There was nothing to say that he would be willing to hear. When I got back to my apartment, the sun was setting over the city. I made myself a simple dinner and ate it alone at my kitchen counter, watching the lights come on in buildings across the skyline. Somewhere out there, millions of people were going about their lives dealing with their own families, their own disappointments, their own moments of triumph and despair. My phone was full of messages now, 12 missed calls from various family members. Text after text demanding explanations, apologies, immediate action. Not a single one of them asked how I was feeling. Not one of them wondered what it had cost me to keep this secret for so long, or what it meant that I had finally decided to reveal it. I picked up the phone and typed a single response to the family group chat. "I am not available tonight. We can talk when I'm ready." Then I turned off the phone and went to sit by the window. The city sparkled below me like a circuit board, all those tiny lights representing lives I would never know. I had spent 30 years trying to make myself visible to people who were determined not to see me. I had dimmed my own light so that I would not outshine anyone, kept my achievements hidden, so that no one would feel threatened, made myself small, so that others could feel large. And what had it gotten me? A family that called me the help at a public event. Parents who issued demands instead of offering love. a brother who measured his own worth by how successfully he could diminish mine. I thought about the email from the Norrington Group that was waiting in my inbox, the $3 billion contract that would change everything. Tomorrow morning there would be negotiations to complete documents to sign a company to restructure. But tonight, I just sat in the darkness and let myself feel the weight of what had happened. Not the triumph of finally being seen, but the grief of understanding that I had been invisible for so long. Something had shifted in me during that boardroom confrontation. The part of me that had always hoped my family would eventually recognize my worth had finally gone quiet. In its place was something harder, colder, more certain. I did not need their recognition anymore. I did not need their approval. I did not need anything from them that they had proven themselves incapable of giving. Tomorrow I would begin building the life I actually wanted. Tonight I would mourn the life I had been waiting for, the one where my family loved me, the way families are supposed to love each other. I fell asleep on the couch sometime after midnight, and for the first time in years, I did not dream about proving myself to anyone. The invitation came the next morning, delivered not as a request, but as a summons. My mother's text read simply, "Dinner tonight, 6 o'clock. We have things to discuss." I knew what this was. I had seen it before every time I stepped out of the role they had assigned me. The family would gather, and they would remind me of my place. They would use guilt and obligation and the weight of shared history to press me back into the shape they preferred. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to stay home in my quiet apartment and let them stew in their confusion. But another part knew that running away would only delay the inevitable. If I was truly done being invisible, I needed to face them directly. I arrived at my parents' house at exactly 6. The colonial-style home looked the same as it always had, with its manicured lawn and American flag by the front door. But walking up that familiar path felt different now. I was not the struggling daughter coming to report on her modest life. I was not the family helper arriving to serve and clean and disappear into the background. I was the woman who owned their son's career. My mother opened the door before I could knock. She was wearing her good pearls, the ones she saved for important occasions. Her smile was tight. "Come in," she said. "Everyone is already here." The dining room had been set with the fine china, the pieces that only came out for holidays and company. My father sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Evan and Delilah occupied their usual places, both of them watching me with a mix of wariness and resentment. I took the empty seat at the end, facing my father across the length of the table. No one spoke while my mother brought out the dishes. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, all my childhood favorites weaponized into a gesture of false warmth. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "What you did yesterday was irresponsible." I unfolded my napkin. "Was it? You humiliated your brother in front of his colleagues. You undermined the CEO of a major company. You made our family look foolish in front of people who matter." I picked up my fork. "None of those people were fooled," I said. "They already knew exactly who you were. Yesterday just made it official." Delilah leaned forward. "This is not fair, Arya. I had no idea who you were at the gala. If you had just told us, none of this would have happened." I looked at her steadily. "If I had told you, you would have treated me differently. That is exactly the point. You should have treated me well regardless." My mother set down her water glass with more force than necessary. "We have always treated you well. We gave you a home and education opportunities your father and I never had. You gave me expectations," I said. "You gave me a role, the quiet daughter who helps out and does not cause trouble, the one who watches while her brother gets everything handed to him." Evan slammed his hand on the table. "I earned my position at Aurelius Tech. I worked for years to build relationships with those people." "You worked to build relationships with people who thought they were doing you a favor," I said, "because of family connections, because they thought helping you would give them access to something valuable. They were right, actually. It just was not you." The table went silent. My mother's eyes were wet. My father's face had gone red. Evan looked like he wanted to overturn the furniture. "This is what you wanted, is it not?" My mother's voice was barely above a whisper. "To hurt us, to pay us back for some imagined slight. Imagined. The word hung in the air between us. When I was 16, I said slowly, I worked 40 hours a week at the diner downtown so I could save money for college. Every Friday, I brought home my paycheck and put half of it in a jar in my closet. One day, that jar was empty. Do you remember what happened to that money? No one answered, but I saw my father's eyes flicker. You took it, I said. You told me you needed it for Evan's car insurance. You said you would pay me back. That was 14 years ago. I never saw a penny. We were going through a difficult time, my mother said. Your father's business was struggling. We had no choice. You had a choice. You just did not choose me. The room felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in around us. My family had spent 30 years convincing me that my memories were exaggerated, my feelings were excessive, my needs were secondary to everyone else's, and I had believed them for so long. Arya, my father said, his voice low and dangerous. You need to think carefully about what you are doing. This company, this power you suddenly have, it does not change who you are. You are still our daughter. You still owe this family respect. I owe this family nothing, I said. Every good thing I have, I built myself. While you were investing in Evan's failures, I was working 18-hour days. While you were celebrating his mediocrity, I was creating something that actually matters. Evan stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. You think you are better than me? You think having money makes you special? I think having money makes it easier to see clearly, I said. When I was broke, I told myself that maybe you all treated me badly because of stress, because of financial pressure, because circumstances were difficult. But circumstances are not difficult anymore. I could buy this house 100 times over, and you still treat me like the help. Delilah started crying. This is not how families work, she sobbed. You do not just turn your back on people who raised you. I looked at her. This woman who had called me staff at a public event less than 48 hours ago. Families protect each other, I said. Families lift each other up. What have any of you ever done to protect me? No one had an answer. I pushed back my chair and stood up. Tomorrow I have meetings about the $3 billion contract, the one that will determine the future of the company where Evan works. I will make decisions that affect hundreds of employees and their families. And I will make those decisions based on what is best for the business, not what is best for anyone sitting at this table. My father's face went pale. You cannot cut your brother out of his own career. I can do whatever I want, I said. That is what having 58% ownership means. I walked toward the door. My mother called after me, her voice cracking. If you leave now, do not expect us to welcome you back. I turned and looked at her one last time. The woman who had birthed me and raised me and spent 3 decades making me feel like I was never quite enough. I stopped expecting anything from you years ago, I said. That is the only reason I survived. I walked out into the evening air. The sky was dark now, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking. I got in my car and drove for a long time, not going anywhere in particular, just moving through the night. When I finally got home, I checked my phone. A message from my mother read, "Do not embarrass us again." I deleted it without responding. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new negotiations, new opportunities to prove what I was capable of. But tonight, I had done something that mattered more than any business deal. I had finally stopped asking for a seat at their table. The morning after that disastrous dinner, I woke to 17 messages on my phone. Most were from family members demanding explanations, apologies, or immediate concessions. But one stood out, an email from the Norrington Group, confirming that their leadership team would be arriving at Aurelius Tech headquarters for the final contract negotiations. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy suit that conveyed authority without ostentation. This was the day everything would become official. The $3 billion contract. My identity as a founding partner. The restructuring that would reshape the company I had built from nothing. When I arrived at headquarters, the lobby was already buzzing with nervous energy. Word had spread about yesterday's revelation, and employees who had never given me a second glance were now studying me with a mixture of curiosity and fear. The conference room on the 39th floor had been set up for the occasion. Representatives from both companies were taking their seats, but what caught my attention was the row of VIP chairs near the back. My parents, Evan and Delilah, were all there sitting together with expressions that ranged from defiant to terrified. I learned later that they had received an urgent message from CEO Holden explaining that the founding partner wanted everyone connected to the gala incident present for this meeting. They thought they were being called in for a reconciliation ceremony, an opportunity to smooth things over and resume their place in the family hierarchy. They had no idea they were walking into a reckoning. I entered through the main door rather than my usual private entrance. Every head in the room turned toward me. The executives from Norrington rose to their feet, immediately followed by a beat later by the Aurelius Tech staff who were still adjusting to the new reality. My family remained seated. They were staring at me with expressions I had never seen before. Not shame exactly, more like the look of gamblers who have just realized the cards were marked against them from the start. Evan leaned over to whisper something to Delilah. His face was pale, and I could see sweat beading at his hairline. Whatever scheme he had been planning, whatever move he thought he could make to salvage his position, it was crumbling in real time. The Norrington CEO, a silver-haired man named Charles Beaumont, crossed the room to shake my hand. "Ms. Lane," he said warmly, "we have been looking forward to this meeting for months. Your vision for this partnership has been extraordinary." "Thank you," I said. "I believe today will mark the beginning of something significant for both our companies." Behind me, I heard my mother whisper to my father, "What is happening? Why are they treating her like that?" My father did not answer. He was watching me with an expression I could not quite read, not quite respectful, not quite fearful, something in between. The meeting began with formal introductions, but I could feel my family's presence like a weight at the back of the room. Every time I spoke, every time the Norrington executives deferred to my judgment or asked my opinion, I sensed their discomfort growing. Halfway through the session, Evan stood up. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "I have some questions about the timeline for implementation." Several people turned to look at him. One of the Norrington vice presidents frowned. "And you are Evan Vale," my brother said, puffing out his chest, "head of strategic development at Aurelius Tech." The vice president glanced at me, then back at Evan. "With respect, Mr. Vale, this is a principal-level negotiation. Perhaps your questions could be addressed in a subsequent meeting." Evan's face went red. "I have been working on this partnership for months. I deserve to be part of this discussion." Delilah grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back into his seat, but he shook her off. Charles Beaumont cleared his throat. "Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. Our contract is with Ms. Lane specifically. She is the founding authority, the majority shareholder, and the architect of the platform we are licensing. Mr. Vale's contributions, while I am sure they are valuable, are not directly relevant to these negotiations." The room went very still. I watched Evan's expression cycle through several stages of humiliation. Denial first, then anger, then a dawning horror, as he realized that every assumption he had made about his own importance was being dismantled in front of 50 witnesses. Delilah was crying silently now. My parents sat frozen in their seats, looking like they wished they could disappear through the floor. Perhaps I said quietly, my family would prefer to wait in the executive lounge while we complete this portion of the meeting. No one objected. A security officer appeared to escort them out, and I watched them file past me without meeting my eyes. My mother's shoulders were shaking. My father walked with the rigid posture of a man who was holding himself together through sheer force of will. Evan paused at the door and turned back to look at me. His eyes were wet, and for a moment I saw him not as the golden child who had received everything I had been denied, but as a man whose entire identity was built on a foundation that had just crumbled. "Aria," he whispered. Why, I could have answered him in 100 different ways. I could have listed every slight, every dismissal, every moment when he had benefited from a system designed to diminish me. But what I said was simpler than that. Because someone needed to tell the truth, I said, and I was tired of waiting for someone else to do it. The door closed behind him and I turned back to the conference table. Now I said to Charles Beaumont, "Where were we?" The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of contract terms and partnership structures. By the time we finished, the afternoon sun was slanting through the windows, and I had signed documents worth more than my parents would earn in several lifetimes. When the Norrington team left, I sat alone in the empty conference room for a long time. The silence felt different now, not lonely but earned, like the quiet that comes after a storm has finally passed. My phone buzzed with a message from my father. "We need to talk. Tonight." I typed back a single word, "Tomorrow." Then I gathered my things and went home to sleep better than I had in years. The emergency board meeting I called for the following morning was not about contracts or quarterly projections. It was about something far more fundamental. I arrived at headquarters before dawn, wanting time to prepare before anyone else showed up. The building was quiet at that hour, all empty hallways and sleeping computers. I walked through the space I had helped create, touching the walls, looking out the windows at the city, just beginning to wake up below. By 8 o'clock, the conference room was full. Every board member, every senior executive, every person with decision-making authority at Aurelius Tech. My family was there too, seated in the same VIP chairs they had occupied the day before. They looked like they had not slept. Delilah's makeup could not quite hide the puffiness around her eyes. Evan kept checking his phone as if expecting news that would somehow reverse everything that had happened. I walked to the front of the room and waited for silence. "Thank you all for coming," I said. "I know yesterday was difficult for many of you. Today we are going to address some things that should have been addressed years ago." I pressed a button on my laptop, and the screen behind me lit up with the first slide of my presentation. It was not charts or graphs or financial data. It was a photograph of me at 19 years old, working the night shift at a diner, my hair pulled back and grease stains on my apron. "This is who I was when I started writing the code that became the foundation of this company," I said. I was working 60 hours a week at minimum wage jobs while taking a full course load. I did not have family support. I did not have investors. I had an idea and a willingness to work harder than anyone else in the room. I clicked to the next slide. Another photograph, this one showing a cramped apartment with computer equipment spread across every surface. This is where the first prototype was built. My roommates thought I was crazy. My professors thought I was wasting my time. My family did not even know what I was doing because they were too focused on my brother's latest venture to ask about mine. Around the room, people shifted uncomfortably. My parents were staring at the screen with expressions I could not read. "I am not showing you these images to ask for sympathy," I continued. "I am showing you because I want you to understand something important. When people look at me today, they see the owner of a multi-billion-dollar company. They see power and money and influence. But I remember what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be treated like someone who did not matter because I had not yet proven my worth in terms they could understand." I clicked through more slides. Documentation of every time Evan had been promoted based on family connections rather than qualifications. Records of complaints filed by female employees that had been ignored or buried. Evidence of expense account irregularities that had been overlooked because the right people were involved. This company was built on a foundation of innovation and hard work, I said. But over the years it has developed problems. Not technical problems, cultural problems. And starting today, those problems are going to be addressed. Holden Marks raised his hand. "Ms. Lane, I want to assure you that any issues with company culture were never intentional." I looked at him steadily. "Intention does not matter," I said. "Impact does. And the impact of the decisions made under your leadership has been harmful to many employees who deserved better." I turned to face my family directly for the first time. I spent my entire life trying to earn recognition from people who were determined not to see me, I said. I thought if I worked hard enough, achieved enough, succeeded enough, eventually you would acknowledge that I had value. But I understand now that the problem was never my achievements. The problem was that you had already decided who I was allowed to be. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but I held up my hand. At the gala 2 nights ago, I was called the help by my own family, in front of business partners, in front of colleagues, in front of people whose respect matters for the future of this company. That moment crystallized something I have been trying to understand for 30 years. I paused, letting the weight of the silence fill the room. You did not see me because you did not want to see me, because seeing me would have meant acknowledging that your golden child was not actually the most talented person in the family, that the daughter you dismissed and overlooked had built something larger than anything you could imagine. That would have threatened the story you needed to believe about your own choices and priorities. Evan stood up. Aria, this is not the place for family drama. I looked at him calmly. You are right, this is a place of business. So let me be clear about the business implications. I clicked on a new slide, a list of names and positions. As of today, I am implementing a comprehensive review of all leadership positions at Aurelius Tech. Everyone will be evaluated based on their actual contributions, not their connections. Those who have earned their positions will remain. Those who have not will be given support in transitioning to more appropriate roles. Evan's face went white. You are firing me. I am giving you an opportunity to prove yourself on your own merits, I said. If you are as talented as you believe you are, you have nothing to worry about. The room erupted in murmurs. Board members were whispering to each other. Executives were checking their phones. My parents sat frozen, apparently unable to process what was happening. I raised my voice slightly. Additionally, I am establishing an independent ethics committee to review all complaints that have been filed in the past 5 years. Anyone who was harmed by policies or decisions that prioritized convenience over justice will have the opportunity to be heard. Ms. Lane, one of the board members, said this seems quite aggressive. Perhaps a more measured approach. I turned to face him directly. A measured approach is what got us here. Women left this company because their concerns were ignored. Talented people were passed over for promotion because they did not have the right connections. We have been measuring our way into mediocrity, and it stops today. No one else objected. I looked at my family one last time. You are welcome to stay and observe the restructuring meetings this afternoon. But I want to be clear about something. Whatever happens between us personally, it will have no impact on my professional decisions. I am not doing this for revenge. I am doing this because it is right. Evan stared at me like he was seeing a stranger, which in a way he was. The little sister who had always accepted her place at the bottom of the family hierarchy no longer existed. In her place stood someone he did not recognize and could not control. The meeting ended with a series of announcements about process changes and timeline. People filed out slowly, many of them stopping to shake my hand or offer words of support. A few executives avoided my eyes altogether, probably calculating how the new reality would affect their own positions. My family left without speaking to me. I watched them walk out together, a tight cluster of shared grievance and wounded pride. For the first time in my life, I did not feel pulled to follow them. I did not feel the need to explain myself or apologize for taking up space. I gathered my things and headed to my office where the real work of rebuilding would begin. The panic set in fast. By noon that same day, my phone was flooded with messages from relatives I barely knew. Aunts and uncles and cousins who had never shown interest in my life were suddenly very concerned about family unity and the importance of forgiveness. My mother had apparently spent the morning calling everyone in her address book, painting a picture of a troubled daughter who had lost her way and needed to be brought back into the fold. I ignored most of the messages, but I saved them. There is something clarifying about seeing manipulation in black and white, each text a small testament to how deep the dysfunction ran. That afternoon, Evan showed up at my office unannounced. My assistant tried to stop him, but he pushed past her and stormed through my door like he still had authority here. "We need to talk," he said, alone. I nodded to my assistant, who closed the door reluctantly behind her. Evan paced back and forth in front of my desk, his hands clenched at his sides. "This has gone too far. You are destroying everything I have built." "What exactly have you built?" I asked quietly. He stopped pacing and stared at me. "My career, my reputation, my position at this company. You mean the position you received because of family connections? The career that was handed to you while I was building this company from the ground up? That is not fair. I worked hard." I leaned back in my chair. "I know you believe that, and maybe by your standards you did work hard. But there is a difference between working hard when every door is already open and working hard when you have to build the doors yourself." Evan slammed his hand on my desk. "You have always resented me, always been jealous of what I had." I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, more like the final pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. I was not jealous of what you had, I said. I was hurt by the way it was given to you. Every advantage, every opportunity, every second chance, after every failure. Meanwhile, I was told to be grateful for scraps, to lower my expectations, to accept that some people just get more than others. Our parents did the best they could. I looked at him steadily. Did they do what was easiest? Investing in you was easy because you expected it. Investing in me would have meant questioning their own assumptions about what daughters are supposed to want and deserve. Evan was quiet for a moment. Then his expression hardened. Fine, you win. Is that what you wanted to hear? You win. Now can things go back to normal? There is no going back, I said. There is only forward. He left without another word. I watched him go and felt nothing but a tired kind of relief. That evening my parents tried a different approach. They showed up at my apartment building and convinced the doorman to let them up. When I opened my door, my mother was standing there with a casserole dish and tears streaming down her face. We made your favorite, she said. Please, let us talk. Part of me wanted to close the door, but a larger part recognized that this was a conversation that needed to happen one way or another. I let them in. We sat in my living room, the casserole untouched on the coffee table between us. My father looked around at the space like he was cataloging evidence. Nice place, he said finally. How long have you lived here? 6 years, I said. His jaw tightened. 6 years. We had no idea you could afford something like this. You never asked. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Arya, sweetheart, we have always loved you. Whatever you think you remember about your childhood, we did our best. I know you believe that I said. But your best included telling me I was too sensitive when I asked for the same things Evan received. Your best included taking my savings without asking and never paying it back. Your best included 20 years of making me feel like I was less valuable than my brother. We never said that my father protested. You did not have to say it. You showed me every single day. The silence stretched between us. Outside, the city hummed with its endless noise. Somewhere far below, people were going about their lives unaware of the small drama playing out 40 floors above them. My mother spoke first. What do you want from us? An apology. We are sorry. There. We are sorry for whatever we did that made you feel this way. I shook my head. That is not an apology. That is you being sorry that I feel bad, not sorry for what you did. What more can we say? I thought about that for a long moment. Nothing, I said finally. There is nothing you can say that will undo 30 years, and I am not asking you to. I am just asking you to understand why things cannot go back to the way they were. My father leaned forward. You are talking about cutting off your own family. Think about what that means. I have thought about it, I said, for a very long time, and I have realized something. The family you are asking me to protect is the family that hurt me, the family that made me feel small and worthless and invisible. Why would I want to go back to that? Because we are your parents, my mother said, her voice breaking. Because that is what families do. They forgive. They move on. I looked at her, this woman who had given me life and then spent 30 years making me feel like it was not quite worth living. I love you, I said. Both of you. But love does not mean accepting abuse. It does not mean pretending that harm did not happen. And it does not mean sacrificing my own well-being to make you comfortable. So, what happens now? My father asked. Now you leave, I said. And we take some time apart. And maybe eventually, if you can demonstrate that you understand what you did and why it was wrong, we can try to build something new. But I am not going to hold my breath. They left with the casserole dish. My mother was crying. My father walked with the rigid posture of a man who could not decide whether to be angry or ashamed. I closed the door behind them and stood in my quiet apartment alone with my choices. Tomorrow there would be meetings and decisions and the endless work of restructuring a company. But tonight I had done something just as important. I had told my parents the truth and let them leave with it. What they did with that truth was up to them. The counterattack came 3 days later, faster and more coordinated than I had expected. It started with a call from a cousin I had not spoken to in years. "Arya," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "the family is really worried about you. Your mother says you have been acting erratically. Maybe you should see someone." "I am fine," I said. "Thank you for your concern. It is just," she continued, "people are talking. They say you had some kind of breakdown at work, that you are trying to destroy your brother's career over childhood jealousy." I ended the call and checked my messages. 17 new texts, all variations on the same theme. Family members I barely knew were suddenly experts on my mental state, all of them gently suggesting that I needed help, that I was not thinking clearly, that I should apologize to my parents and brother before I did something I would regret. The smear campaign had begun. I spent the morning reviewing the messages, not because they hurt me, but because I wanted to understand the strategy. My family had decided that if they could not control me directly, they would try to control the narrative. They would tell everyone that the successful businesswoman who had just signed a $3 billion contract was actually unstable, vindictive, consumed by petty jealousy. It was a clever move, actually. If they could not diminish my accomplishments, they could at least try to diminish my character. I called my legal team. By afternoon, we had a response prepared, a carefully worded statement to be distributed to anyone who needed to know the truth. Documentation of my business accomplishments, including dates and figures that could be independently verified, character references from colleagues and partners who had worked with me for years. But the most important conversation happened that evening when I received an unexpected visitor. Helena Martinez lived in the apartment next to my parents' house. She had been my neighbor for most of my childhood, a retired school teacher who used to give me cookies and listen to me talk about my dreams. She was one of the few adults from my past who had ever seemed to genuinely care about my well-being. She showed up at my building without warning, and the doorman called up to ask if I would see her. I said yes. Helena looked older than I remembered, her hair completely white now, but her eyes were sharp and kind. She sat on my couch and accepted a cup of tea before saying anything. "I heard what they are saying about you," she said finally. "Your mother called half the neighborhood yesterday, telling everyone you had lost your mind. I'm not surprised." She shook her head slowly. "I told her she was wrong. I have watched you since you were a little girl, Arya. I saw how hard you worked, how little they gave you, how much they expected you to do without complaint. I felt tears prick at my eyes for the first time in days. 'Thank you,' I said. 'That means more than you know.' I also told her something else," Helena continued. "I told her that I had never seen you stronger than you seem right now, that whatever you are doing, it looks like the actions of someone who has finally figured out who she is." I set down my tea and looked at this woman who had been kinder to me than my own parents. "They are trying to make me feel crazy," I said. "They want me to doubt myself." Helena reached over and patted my hand. "Do you doubt yourself?" I thought about it honestly. "No, I do not." "Then their opinions do not matter." She smiled, the same warm smile I remembered from childhood. "The people who love you will see the truth, and the people who believe their lies were never really on your side to begin with." She left a few hours later, but her words stayed with me. That night I received an email from my brother. It was longer than any of his previous messages, and I could tell he had spent time crafting it. "Arya," he wrote, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. I know things have been tense between us, but we are still family. We should not let business disagreements destroy our relationship. Can we meet tomorrow to discuss how to move forward? I am willing to compromise." I replied with 3 sentences. "I am open to meeting, but I want to be clear about something. There will be no compromises on the restructuring. We can discuss our personal relationship, but my professional decisions are final." His response came an hour later. "Fine, but I think you will regret this." I turned off my phone and went to sleep. The next morning, I learned that Evan had spent the night calling board members, trying to drum up support for a vote of no confidence in my leadership. He had been making promises he could not keep, suggesting alliances he had no authority to offer. By the time I arrived at the office, 3 different executives had forwarded me recordings of his calls. I called my legal team again. By noon, Evan had received an official notice from Human Resources. His position at Aurelius Tech was being reviewed, pending an investigation into his attempt to undermine company leadership. He was being placed on administrative leave effective immediately. My phone rang. It was my father. "What have you done?" he demanded. "You cannot fire your own brother." "I did not fire him. He is being investigated for insubordination. There is a difference. This is revenge, pure and simple. This has consequences. There is a difference there, too." He hung up on me. I went back to work. That evening, I received confirmation from the Norrington Group that all contract terms had been finalized. The $3 billion deal was done. My company's future was secure, and despite everything my family had tried to do, I was still standing. I allowed myself a small smile as I read the confirmation email. They had started a war they could not win. The Norrington Group's CEO, Charles Beaumont, flew in personally for the signing ceremony. It was the kind of event that would normally be covered by business publications and industry newsletters, but I had requested that media coverage be kept to a minimum. This moment was not about publicity. It was about completion. The conference room had been arranged with careful attention to detail. A long mahogany table dominated the space with the contract documents laid out in neat stacks at the center. Representatives from both companies filled the chairs along each side, their expressions a mixture of excitement and relief that months of negotiation had finally reached this conclusion. I arrived early and spent a few minutes looking out the window at the city below. Somewhere down there, my family was probably plotting their next move. My brother was on administrative leave, his career hanging by a thread. My parents were still trying to convince anyone who would listen that I had lost my mind. And Delilah had started a whisper campaign among the society wives, suggesting that my success was somehow unearned or suspicious. None of it mattered anymore. When Charles arrived, he crossed the room to shake my hand. "Ms. Lane, this is a historic day for both our companies." "I agree," I said, "though I admit I am ready for the negotiations to be over." "There are other things I need to focus on," he laughed. "I imagine there are. I have heard some interesting rumors about changes at Aurelius Tech. Restructuring is always challenging, but necessary." The door opened and more people filed in. Board members, department heads, legal representatives. And then, to my surprise, my brother. Evan walked in like he owned the room. He was wearing his best suit, the one he saved for occasions when he wanted to impress. His expression was a mask of confidence that I recognized from years of watching him bluff his way through situations he did not actually understand. Behind him came Delilah, her smile brittle and her eyes calculating. They took seats near the back of the room, clearly intending to observe the proceedings. I caught the eye of my head of security, who shrugged slightly. He had not been able to stop them without creating a scene. Fine, let them watch. The ceremony proceeded smoothly. Contract terms were reviewed, signatures were collected, photographs were taken for company archives. Charles Beaumont gave a short speech about the future of the partnership and the vision that had made it possible. "I would like to take a moment," he said, "to specifically acknowledge Ms. Aria Lane. The platform we are licensing today was her brainchild. The architecture, the algorithms, the fundamental innovation that makes this partnership valuable all came from her work. She built something remarkable, and she did it while facing obstacles that would have stopped most people." Around the room, heads nodded. In the back, Evan's face went red. Charles continued, "In my experience, the most valuable partnerships are built on mutual respect. I respect Ms. Lane not just for what she has accomplished, but for how she accomplished it. With integrity, with persistence, and with a commitment to excellence that never wavered." He raised his glass. "To Ms. Lane. And to the future we are building together." The room echoed the toast. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, unaccustomed to this kind of public recognition. When the ceremony ended, people began to mingle and celebrate. Charles pulled me aside. "I hope you do not mind me saying," he said quietly, "but I have heard about your family situation, the challenges you have faced internally." I tensed slightly. "News travels fast." He nodded. "It does. And for what it is worth, I want you to know something. In all my years of business, I have never seen anyone handle a difficult situation with more grace than you have. Lesser people would have been vindictive. You have been fair. I am not sure everyone would agree with that assessment. The people who matter would." He smiled and squeezed my shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Ms. Lane. You have earned everything that is coming your way." He moved off to speak with other guests, and I was left alone for a moment in the middle of the celebration. Evan appeared at my elbow. "Quite a show. he said, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "It is not a show. It is business. You humiliated me. In front of everyone." I turned to face him directly. "Evan, you put yourself on administrative leave by trying to undermine the company. I did not do that to you. You did it to yourself." His jaw clenched. "This is not over." "You are right," I said. "It is not. There is still an investigation to complete, and depending on what it finds, there may be further consequences." "I am your brother," he hissed. "Does that mean nothing to you?" I thought about that question carefully before answering. It used to mean everything I said. I used to believe that family was more important than anything else, that I should accept whatever treatment you gave me because we shared the same blood. But I learned something important over the years. That the people who hurt you most are often the ones who think they have a right to. Evan stared at me for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, some wall crumbling that he had not even known was there. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. His voice was quieter now, almost vulnerable. "I know you believe that, and maybe you did not mean to. But the effect was the same either way." I left him standing there and went to say goodbye to the rest of the guests. When I finally made it back to my office, the sun was setting over the city, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. I sat at my desk and looked at the signed contract in front of me. $3 billion, a partnership that would shape the future of my company for decades to come. And I had done it all without any help from the family that had tried so hard to keep me small. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "We need to talk about Evan. Please call me." I typed back a single word, "Tomorrow." Then I leaned back in my chair and let myself feel for just a moment the weight of everything I had accomplished. Tomorrow there would be more battles to fight, more family drama to navigate, more decisions to make about the future of the company I had built. But tonight, I won. The storm that had been building for weeks finally broke on a Thursday evening when my entire family showed up at my apartment unannounced. I was just finishing a quiet dinner when the doorman called up to tell me I had visitors. Multiple visitors. Insistent ones. I let them come up. The elevator doors opened and they poured into my hallway like a flood. My father first, his face red with barely controlled rage. My mother behind him clutching her purse like a weapon. Evan and Delilah bring up the rear, their expressions a mixture of desperation and defiance. I opened my door before they could knock. "I was wondering when you would all show up together," I said. "Come in." They filed into my living room and arranged themselves on my furniture like they were staging an intervention, which I suppose they were. My father spoke first. "This has gone far enough. You are tearing this family apart over some grudge from your childhood." I sat in the chair across from them. "Some grudges. That is an interesting way to describe 30 years of being treated like I did not exist." "We never treated you that way," my mother protested. "You were always loved. I was always tolerated. There is a difference." Evan leaned forward. "Look, I get it. You are angry. You feel like you got the short end of the stick. But this witch hunt you are running at the company is destroying my career. Your career was built on a foundation you did not earn. The witch hunt, as you call it, is just revealing what was already true." Delilah spoke up. "This is about the gala, is it not? That stupid comment I made, I already said I regretted what I said." "You said you regretted what you said," I said, "not for what you did. There is a difference there, too." The room fell silent. I could feel the weight of their collective frustration pressing against me, all four of them wanting something I was no longer willing to give. My father tried a different approach. "Think about what you are doing to the family name. People are talking. They say the Lanes are falling apart." The family name I repeated. "You mean the name I was told was too important for me to sully? The name you used to explain why I could not have the same opportunities as Evan? The name that was always more important than my actual well-being? That is not fair," my mother said. I stood up and walked to the window. The city sparkled below millions of lights representing millions of lives. "Let me tell you something about fairness," I said, without turning around. "When I was 22, I got accepted to a prestigious graduate program, full scholarship. It was everything I had worked for. Do you remember what you said when I told you my mother was quiet? You said that was nice, but you were too busy planning Evan's engagement party to talk about it. You asked me if I could help with the decorations. That was years ago." I turned to face her. It was a pattern. Every time I achieved something, it was minimized or ignored. Every time Evan failed, it was excused or explained away. You did not see me because you did not want to see me, because seeing me would have meant admitting that you had been unfair for your entire lives. We made mistakes, my father said. All parents do. I looked at him, this man who had taken my savings and never acknowledged it, who had put his hand on Evan's shoulder and called him the future of the family while I stood invisible in the corner. The difference, I said, is that some parents learn from their mistakes. Some parents grow. You just kept making the same ones over and over again. So what do you want? Evan demanded. You want us to grovel? To beg for forgiveness? What will it take for you to stop this? I do not want you to grovel. I want you to understand. Understand what I walked back to my chair and sat down looking at each of them in turn. For 30 years, I tried to earn my place in this family. I worked harder, achieved more, asked for less. I thought eventually you would see me, that if I was just good enough, patient enough, successful enough, you would finally treat me like I mattered. I paused, feeling the truth of the words settling into the air between us. What I understand now is that it was never about me. I could not earn your love because you had already decided it belonged to someone else, and nothing I did was ever going to change that. My mother started crying. Arya, please. We love you. We have always loved you. Then love me differently, I said. Love me as the person I actually am, not the person you decided I was supposed to be. The silence stretched. Outside, the city hummed its endless song. Inside, 4 people who shared my blood sat in my home and struggled with the reality of what I had become. My father spoke first. If we try harder, if we make an effort to change, will you stop the restructuring at the company? I shook my head. No, the company decisions stand regardless of what happens between us personally. That is not about revenge. That is about building something better. Then what is the point? Evan asked. Why are we even here? I stood up. The point is that I am telling you the truth, something I should have done years ago. I am not going to pretend anymore. I am not going to shrink myself to make you comfortable. And I am not going to accept treatment that makes me feel worthless just because we are related. So you are cutting us off, Delilah said flatly. I am setting boundaries. If you can respect them, we can have a relationship. If you cannot, then yes, we will go our separate ways. I walked to the door and opened it. I think you should leave now, I said. We all have a lot to think about. They filed out slowly. My mother still crying. My father rigid with suppressed anger. Evan looking lost. Delilah looking calculating. As they waited for the elevator, my father turned back. If your grandmother was alive to see this, he said she would be ashamed. I felt the words like a knife. He was talking about the only person who had ever truly seen me. She would be proud, I said quietly. She always told me I was stronger than I knew. The elevator doors closed and they were gone. I stood in my doorway for a long moment, feeling the echo of their presence fade from the air. Then I closed the door and went to pour myself a glass of wine. The hardest part was over. I had finally told them the truth. Now I just had to figure out how to live with the consequences. I woke to sunlight streaming through my bedroom windows, and a silence so complete it felt almost sacred. For the first time in weeks, my phone was not buzzing with angry messages. No demands, no accusations, no attempts at manipulation. Just quiet. I made coffee and sat by the window watching the city come alive below. Somewhere out there, my family was dealing with the aftermath of last night's confrontation. My brother was facing the reality that his career had been built on a foundation that no longer existed. My parents were trying to understand how their invisible daughter had become someone they could no longer ignore. But here in my apartment, surrounded by the life I had built for myself, I felt something I had not felt in years. Peace. I spent the morning going through my email, responding to congratulations from business partners and handling the small administrative details that follow any major deal. The $3 billion contract was signed. The company restructuring was underway. Everything I had worked for was finally coming together. Around noon, I put on my jacket and went for a walk. The park near my building was full of people enjoying the autumn weather. Families with children, couples holding hands, elderly people feeding the pigeons. I walked among them, feeling like I was seeing the world with new eyes. For so long I had been carrying a weight I did not even know was there. The constant effort of trying to earn love that should have been given freely. The exhausting performance of being small enough not to threaten anyone. The quiet desperation of hoping that someday, somehow, things would change. Now that weight was gone. I sat on a bench and watched a mother push her daughter on a swing. They were laughing together, the child's joy reflected in her mother's face. I thought about what it might have been like to grow up that way, to be seen, to be valued, to know without question that you were loved exactly as you were. I would never know that feeling from my own family. But I had learned something more important. I could give that feeling to myself. My phone buzzed. A message from Helena, my childhood neighbor. Thinking of you today. You are braver than you know. I typed back, "Thank you for everything." She responded with a heart emoji and nothing else. Sometimes the simplest gestures say the most. When I got back to my apartment, there was an email waiting from Charles Beaumont. The board at Norrington has been discussing our partnership. They want to extend our collaboration significantly. We believe you have a unique vision for the future, and we want to be part of it. I read the email twice, letting the words sink in. A unique vision for the future, not a vision shaped by my family's expectations or my brother's shadow or my parents' narrow definition of what a daughter should be. My vision, built from my own experiences, my own struggles, my own hard-won wisdom. I wrote back, "I am honored. Let us set up a meeting to discuss the details." That evening, I sat down with a notebook and wrote a letter. Not to send, just for myself. Dear past me, I know you are tired. I know you feel invisible. I know you wonder sometimes if anyone will ever see you for who you really are. I want you to know that it gets better. Not because the people who hurt you will change, but because you will change. You will learn that your worth does not depend on their recognition. You will discover that the love you were looking for from them was inside you all along. You will build something amazing, not to prove anything to anyone, but because that is who you are. A builder, a creator, a woman who refuses to be defined by other people's limitations. Hold on. Keep working. Keep believing in yourself even when no one else does. The best is yet to come. I closed the notebook and set it aside. Outside my window, the city was settling into the evening. Lights were coming on in buildings across the skyline, each one representing a life I would never know. But I no longer felt separate from all of it. I felt connected, part of something larger than my family, larger than my company, larger than any single relationship or conflict. My phone buzzed one more time, a message from my mother. "I have been thinking about what you said. Maybe we can try to understand each other better. No pressure. Just if you want to talk." I stared at the message for a long moment. It was not an apology, not really, but it was something different from what I had received before. A crack in the wall, maybe, a small opening. I typed back, "Maybe. Give me some time." Then I set down my phone and looked out at the evening sky. And there, with the city glowing beneath me, a memory rose clear and warm of my grandmother, standing at her tiny kitchen counter, stirring tea in a chipped porcelain cup. She once told me that strength isn't loud. It isn't the person who wins the argument or the voice that shouts the longest. Strength is the quiet decision to keep becoming yourself, even when no one else understands who that is yet. For years, I thought she meant surviving. Tonight, I finally understood she meant living. The story of my family was not over. There would be more conversations, more conflicts, more attempts to find common ground or accept that there was none. The restructuring at the company would continue with all its challenges and complications. The $3 billion contract would bring new opportunities and new responsibilities. But none of that was what mattered most. What mattered was that I had finally stopped waiting for permission to be myself. I had finally stopped shrinking to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold me. I had finally looked at the people who raised me and said, "This is who I am. Accept it or do not." But I am done pretending to be someone else. The pain did not disappear. Did not. It probably never would completely. but it had transformed into something else. Wisdom, maybe. Or strength. The kind of strength that comes from surviving what you thought would destroy you. If you have made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever felt invisible to the people who were supposed to love you, I want you to know that you are not alone. Your worth does not depend on their recognition. Your value does not decrease because they failed to see it. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment. If you have ever had to find your own strength when the people around you were trying to keep you small, share your experience. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe.